So we've already discussed the importance of context in some of the means by which space-time travel communication forms are interpreted, but also in the way that poetry, poetics, and messages in general are interpreted. So I'm focusing on this quotation: "Do something," which could mean many things. But as I pan back, and it becomes clear that this particular utterance is a citation, a quotation of someone in the crowd, right, of protesters during the Senate's public presentation following the leak of the Supreme Court's response and draft of an opinion leaked to Politico regarding overturning Roe versus Wade, and knowing that this utterance occurs in that context narrows the focus of its meaning and our ability to interpret it. And I'm focusing on this today because sometimes contexts are shaped by the intentions and rhetorical strategies of speakers in ways that belie the truth and the intentions behind actions. And I want to focus today on Senate Democrats, and in particular Chuck 1600 Schumer and his insistence that this goes to vote, even though he largely realizes that I'm not going to say that the vote on this issue is a rhetorical exercise, because it's not. But I want to point to what its function really is. But I want to talk about the way that the rhetoric that Schumer utilizes to justify this vote that he knows is not going to pass because as the filibuster stands, right, the Democrats would barely have a 50-50 split, and in fact they need a 60-40 to get this through without eliminating the filibuster. So the first glance, at some of the rhetoric I want to take a look at belongs to us, those that are involved in radical actions and have had a stake in women's right to choose for a long time, and have engaged this as part of our political activism. And so these following statements come from Renee Bracey Sherman, who's an abortion rights activist from We Testify, and she was at the Supreme Court on Tuesday. And I highly recommend and encourage anyone who's in the Washington, D.C. area, and by Washington, D.C. area, I mean, if you're on the Eastern Seaboard, please, and you're an activist, please get yourself to Washington, D.C. and, whatever, bring as many coat hangers or other, activist props as you can, and leave them on the steps of the Supreme Court. I mean, and if honestly, if my geographical location made it possible, I would be protesting every day, and I'm sure I would have been arrested, quite a few times already on this issue. But Renee Bracey Sherman was there, and from We Testify, and her point is very simple. she noted that we need lawmakers to open up discourses on strategy and actions that are actually going to be accomplished, to protect abortion rights and to protect women's rights to choose what to do with their bodies in this country. And she noted that she asked Biden, I'll just read the quotation, "We asked for the President of the United States to come out and speak to all of us and talk about the abortion crisis and give us a plan of what he's going to do." And, he probably won't do that, right? Until he does that and actually acts on the plan, it is not enough. So, like we expected, Biden has little sound bites, and then that's pretty much it, and then we go on. And she noted that was true for all of the politicians who say they support abortion rights. And then I like this quote: "Time and time again, we have seen Democrats use abortion rights as a campaign issue and fail to deliver on their promises to protect and expand our right to reproductive freedom." This is another individual. I'm not sure how I pronounce her name, but Ana Lilia Mejia, co-executive director of the Center for Popular Democracy. All right, so we deserve leadership that represents the vast majority of Americans who believe abortion should be accessible and affordable to all who acquire this critical health care. Now, that statement is somewhat misleading, and that statement may have been true in 1995, but it's somewhat misleading now. The vast majority of Americans who believe that abortion should be accessible and affordable to all who require this critical health care. The opinion on whether abortion belongs to the domain of civil rights and human rights or not has the difference between those who believe that and those who believe that who are pro-life. That word that means basically that women have no rights over their bodies has narrowed since 1995 considerably. In 1995, the percentage of pro-choice individuals in the United States, according to Gallup poll, was 56% versus 33%. Today, the statistics are much narrower, and we're talking about 3% margins that actually cross over one another in certain years. For example, in the poll in 2019, I believe it was 2019, the pro-life count in that particular Gallup poll actually exceeded the pro-choice poll. So the public opinion has really narrowed. And then if you factor in the fact that, and I'll go to another chart here. If you factor in that these are the percentages for popular vote, red being Republican and blue being Democrat. So in both the 2020 race and the 2016 race, right? Democrat presidential candidates won the election according to the popular vote, but lost the election according to the electoral vote. And this has to do with gerrymandering and what's referred to as voter clout, which means that, in a state, because of the way that the electorate systems and the voting count work, in states where there are fewer, where the population is lower, you have more, your vote counts for more. So if you really want your votes to count for a lot, you should move to Wyoming. Of course, there's nothing to do in Wyoming, and there are no jobs, right? Okay, that's another thing, right? Republican states are not as economically well endowed as Democrat states. So all the economic power and all the people, right, are in the states that belong to the Democrats. But all the voting power is in the states that belong to the Republicans. All right, so what I'm trying to do with this chart is put that narrow margin in perspective. Okay, so if we have a narrow margin of 3% right now that crosses over, and we have cloud that increases in Republican areas, right? So the representation actually that gives you a lot of information about the weight of that discrepancy, right? Okay, so even if you have a narrow margin in favor of pro-choice, the way that it's inflected in voting systems, it's always going to favor the Republican, the neo-fascist Republican side, because of the way that the electorate works and because of the way that it's been manipulated, right, in drawing these lines and in taking voting away from those that represent the Democratic majority. All right, so even that narrow majority that supports pro-choice doesn't reflect accurately voting system dynamics, and what I'm getting at, and the importance of all of this, and figuring out the math and actually understanding it, has a lot to do with what's going to be my critique. Not so much of this activist, because I'm sure her heart is in the right place and she's doing all the work that she can on this issue, but in terms of what the Democrats, and in particular, and we're not even going to talk about Sinema and Manchin today, because that's a whole other issue. But we're just going to talk about Schumer's response. And all right, so before I turn to Chuck 1600 Schumer's response and the rhetoric that he employs, and what it seems like that rhetoric means, but what in fact his real motivations are, I need to show this chart just to demonstrate that I'm not making these numbers up. All right, so the vast majority of Americans did in fact support pro-choice platform in 1995, and we can see that that's true by this simple Gallup poll, right, with respect to the abortion. And this was the question, and there are a number of different charts that map different things, like, for example, like whether you believe that abortion is a right under all circumstances, is a right under certain circumstances, etc., or should always be illegal. And then there are other questions that have been mapped in these terms as well. But this question is simply, with respect to the abortion issue, would you consider yourself to be pro-choice or pro-life? Like, so it's a binary, it's a black and white, question. But what makes it valuable? And of course, there's a lot of ambiguity, and of course, there's a lot of psychological material that isn't recorded in this response. But what makes it valuable precisely is the fact that it measures on this one single question, in terms of the binary opposition, a demonstration of how the American public's vote may swing, according to this, single issue. All right, so in a way, the question is politicized more than it is activated, if that makes any sense. All right, so here are the numbers in the great age of freedom, I guess, 1995, before the, I guess, what could be called, Christian fascist apocalypse that we have today, right? that Margaret Atwood, so insightfully predicted that we would have in what seemed to be science fiction, but now, much less seems to be science fiction and seems to be rather a sort of Ramona Clay of the future. Anyway, 56% pro-choice, 33%, and then it narrowed a bit, but seemed to be narrowing until what looks to be sometime just prior to 2002, in which there was a convergence, and then you see it fluctuate up and down, and then these fluctuations up and down can be interpreted in two ways, and we need to talk about the ways that these fluctuations can be interpreted. Okay, so the first way that these fluctuations can be interpreted has to do with the poll itself, and polls and these kinds of representations, right? Because they're trying to be accurate. So these measurement tools are trying to accurately portray political positions and ideologies in the United States. But the tools themselves, just like the SAT, on which one can get, I don't know what the lowest score is, but let's just say it's 800. From 800 to 1600, is only as accurate a tool as the construction of the measurement allows itself to be. And anyone who's invested any time looking at the work that we've done that's both artistic and social, political, and economic on this website, on our YouTube channel, will recognize that some very obvious what would you call it, measurement flaws, right, are built into the test itself. For example, like I've talked about my dysgraphia and how it's very hard because of my handwriting, to keep track of what number of the test that I'm on and to fill it in properly. And then there are all kinds of instructions on the test that tell you that if you don't fill them in properly, your marks, may not be read correctly, and of course that gives rise to anxiety. And anxiety gives rise to even increased difficulty in handwriting for dysgraphics, and these tests are definitely not designed for dysgraphics. Okay, so even if I knew all of the answers, even if I could get a good Schumer 1600 score, the dysgraphia itself would probably, and I don't have a measurement tool to demonstrate or prove this, but would probably reduce that score to close to 1400. So I'm starting out with 1400, not 1600, just because of the limitations that I have in terms of time and ability to fill in this work, and then from there, add on the anxiety that takes it down to 1300, and then obviously this is a very abstract expression, right? And I'm not trying to convince anybody that these numbers are accurate. I'm just giving a brief demonstration of how the tool fails. All right, so every tool has a degree of and you can actually take these tools, and there are mathematical formulas by which you can measure the degree of accuracy in these tools, and there are ways that you can measure what they actually measure instead of what they think that they're measuring as well. And anyone who's done work on statistics, at least in a pedagogical education, knows that this is one of the reasons that we criticize these measurement tools, such as the national and state testing as it exists today, in which students are sorted by their responses to these tests more than they're sorted by the fact that they're human beings in a democratic system with dreams and desires that could easily be fulfilled if resources were available, etc., etc., etc. So one of the ways of interpreting, beyond what this test pretends to measure, these variables here, and this fluctuation, and the way that the lines move, back and forth across one another, is accuracies within the measurement tool itself, right? That it's a narrow margin, and in fact, what we are seeing as movement across time is just fluctuations in those moments of the data gathering, in which the inaccuracies of the sample and the inaccuracies of the measurement tool itself are being reflected in the movement of the line. Okay, that's one way to interpret it, and it needed to be put out there because it's definitely part of it. But even given that, you can see that something happened after 1995, and that the margin decreased. All right. So the second way that we can interpret these fluctuations is in terms of public opinion, and what my former acquaintance is very fond of referring to as robopathology. So we're all subject to opinions. There's a great Gang of Four song. People have opinions. Where do they come from? I love the Gang of Four because they're great punk band, but they're also intellectually fairly sophisticated, and their take on ideology is it belongs to that domain of intellectual thinkers whose opinions are formed, scientifically, with limited, prejudices contaminating the analysis. So what I'm referring to is, the left and intellectually, savvy. Politically sophisticated, right? Educated, social analysis that has been losing ground in the United States quite clearly, like not only demonstrated, by this chart, but other charts. If we were to look at like charts of, do you believe in evolution, or, or what is the significance of critical race theory, right? We would, which didn't exist in its current form in 1995. But if we found, let's say you were going to, ask intellectuals in an academic domain about the Frankfurt School in 1995, you might have a different response. You might have a different chart than you have today, and that's of great concern, right? So, but anyway, in this Gang of Four song, the lyric is, people have opinions. Where do they come from? And so the assumption isn't that we're these completely free and self-determined and self-determining. It's not this like Americana model of individuality and the self-made person. It's this idea that we're subject to these ideological forces, and that our opinions grow out of our relationship to these ideologies and our experiences of their results and manifestations in our lives. For example, like if you're, a white, middle American, farm owner, your experience of the local police force and interactions with the police may be, quite extraordinarily different than if you're a teenage African American male in Chicago, within the same period, and so those experiences, reflect our relationship, our embodied relationship to ideologies, and hence our political relationships to systems that we exist in, and whether, you know, those relationships, right, can be made useful and challenging in terms of something like the distinction between joining a gang and becoming a political activist also have to do with the resources available in the community, right? So I was very excited, you know, in looking at, you know, some areas in Albuquerque recently where I saw, like, there's an activist center, and on the outside of it, you know, there's an image of Leonard Peltier, and it says, you know, Free Leonard, and I was thinking, okay, so when we move to Albuquerque, I'll be able to go here, and I'll be able to participate in NAACP meetings, and all of those domains, right, and all of those and that access, right, to that community involvement, you could consider a resource, and those resources determine, you know, whether you become or have the ability to become, you know, part of the machinery that changes and challenges, or whether you end up, you know, joining a gang and selling drugs, because you can't get a job, right, and you have to survive, you know, and you can, you know, you can figure out a way of maybe getting a ringer and cheating on the SAT, you know, because you have dysgraphia or something else, right? And then getting into a good college. Or you can, you know, take another route. But you have to have those resources, even to get that ringer, even to get Mr. Riddle to take the test for you, Chuck. You had to have the money to invest, right, in that strategy. All right, so the first, going back to the point, the first reading of these fluctuations is just of the measurement tool itself. The second reading is people have opinions. Where do they come from? Events occur in time, and they change public opinion. So, for example, if you're talking about, you know, like, do we need Homeland Security, and there's just been a bombing, you know, people's opinions are going to change. And that's what, you know, my former acquaintance, you know, referred to as robopathology, right? So people want to belong to the majority. And this desire that's so well documented, you know, by individuals like Erich Fromm and other members of the critical of the Frankfurt School, which sometimes is referred to now as critical theory, and in some ways, you know, that critical race theory is partially influenced by, like, this kind of thinking that begins with the question, where do they come from? People have opinions. They don't belong to us. How are we informed? In some way, these very tools of understanding, you know, how we have opinions are being denied us today, right? So you can't even talk about the discrepancies in sophisticated intellectual terms anymore, because it's like, well, at least, you know, it's under fire, right? And so all of these terms become like euphemisms in a way for. So critical race theory is used, like, as a euphemism for kind of insult, in the same way that liberal is used as an insult, right? And you might as well put a descriptive adjective in front of it, and for these people, because it's really for these individuals a dirty word. So that kind of dirty word strategy, you know, is being used to close, right? To close understanding, and to close critique and to close thoughtfulness and to close, real investigation and research, and part of that, also, is represented by this chart. But that's not even really what I wanted to talk about. But censorship, right? So anytime books are banned and you're not allowed to get this information and you're not allowed the science, and science is put into question, you're narrowing this this band here, right? But what I really wanted to talk about were, within critical theory and interpretive analysis of human consciousness that, individuals like Marcuse and Fromm and others engaged in, and to some extent, Foucault as well, even though, he didn't, see himself in line with, certain aspects of that particular camp of ideological criticism. But what I wanted to point to in relationship to this band and these crossings and what they might represent from a point of view of critical theory is that first of all, from people want to belong to the majority, and so as minute changes in the perception of what public opinion might be, and these are produced by the media and by the government, right? So the media, for example, Fox News is always is as Fox News gains power, right, and that you're overwhelmed with Fox News. And okay, I can demonstrate that this is the case because I can't stand Rupert Murdoch. I despise Rupert Murdoch. I hate everything that Fox News stands for and their ideology. I have no relationship to Fox News whatsoever. But I'm going to open up a new window. But if I go to my YouTube channel and I go to my homepage, I get assaulted by all kinds of stuff that I have no relationship to. Do I care about Johnny Depp versus Amber Heard? Not at all. Not one bit. I do get occasionally some stuff that I've looked at. I like the Brooklyn Rail, and I look at their stuff. But I don't. I go out of my way, right, not to look at this, and look at how it's littered my page, right? It's incredible. It's just okay. So that it's an onslaught, an assault, right? And that influences this as well. So public perception of who the majority is. So if Rupert Murdoch can put all of this information out and make it look like that's the majority, according to this analysis of human psychology and human consciousness, that in fact influences public opinion because people want to belong to the majority, whether that majority is fascist or not, right? So what might be going on in, for example, okay, let's look at the high number on pro-life. What might be going on in 2019? Well, what I remember in 2019 is James Comey and the Hillary Clinton investigation, and later, he apologized and said he wished, he hadn't, helped Trump, gain the presidency in the elections in 2020, but it was too late, Mr. Comey. And then, when he wrote his book and became the hero, it was kind of ironic because, well, yeah, we know that Trump is a bad guy, but who helped him get in, right? Anyway, so there was a lot of misogyny in 2019 around Hillary Clinton, and there was a lot of production moving toward the Trump election, right? And And if we're discounting that this might be a measurement flaw, and we're discounting, that that this might be a censorship issue, right? Like if you can't talk about these things, then how are you going to have an informed opinion about these things, right? So like, is it science, right? Or is it, if we can't talk about science, then how are you going to have an opinion about human rights, in any context in which medicine is involved, that really relates to the human experience in any significant and significative way? Well, you can't, obviously. So, but if we discount all of that, you can find maybe perhaps motivations for fluctuations in which people respond to the robopathology of I want to fit in like everyone else. And our critique of our former acquaintance wasn't really made on terms of disagreeing with that, but rather pointing out that that mask mandates aren't the best example of towing the line and becoming a robopath in these terms, when there's in fact medical and scientific evidence that not only are masks useful, and not only are they tools of containing the dangerous results of the epidemic, but in fact ignoring the statistical data of the lives taken and the social impact of the coronavirus is largely a position of white middle class privilege, and if not white middle class privilege, white privilege, because where the impact is seen as greatest is in places like where I am right now on the Navajo Nation, where you can't get into the hospital if you have the coronavirus and are suffering. And there's a hospital just within half a mile of where I live, and it's effectively full, and it's effectively failing to provide adequate treatment because of the devastating volume of cases. And if you look at some of the statistics, you'll see that not only Native Americans, but African Americans as well, and other individuals of color have suffered the greatest impact. And so the critique there was that, you didn't look at the information. The robopathology isn't, oh, yes, we should all wear masks, just follow everyone else. The robopathology is rather, putting your head in the sand like everyone else does, and not understanding the science, and not understanding the data, and not understanding the socio-demographic relationships to the epidemic itself. All right, so given this chart and the narrowing and the reasons for the narrowing, having been provided, you get some sense that what this represents is that in the American consciousness today, it's very narrow. There's a very narrow margin of what probably represents a majority on the part of pro-choice, but narrowly so. All right, but if you run those numbers across, right, their political values, you'll see that narrow margin of what might be the difference between 3% is inflected by voting and political system distortions in a way that effectively you do have a majority of voting power, right, devoted to pro-life. And so, returning to what I want to discuss in relationship to Chuck 1600's response, and I'll go ahead and read it. So all of your your knowledge and information, the information that you have regarding the limitations of that Senate Democrats have in getting anything through right now will inform this response. Your interpretation of Chuck Schumer's response to the situation. Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer promised to hold a vote to codify the right to an abortion in law. But he was careful not to promise that it would pass. Well, he knows that it won't pass, and he knows that it won't pass precisely because we've had these exercises before. And here's the rhetoric that I want to utilize to demonstrate something. A vote on this legislation is not an abstract exercise. This is as urgent and real as it gets, Schumer said on the Senate floor. We will vote to protect a woman's right to choose, and every American is going to see which side every senator stands. Okay, can you not already see that that's shooting yourself in the foot based on the math that I just presented? Okay, so if you don't get that, let's go back. All right, so we have a very narrow majority represented by the Gallup poll, and it apparently continues to narrow, right? So we have a very narrow majority represented by the Gallup poll that's almost 50-50 that represents the majority as identifying with a woman's right to choose rather than as pro-life, right? Okay, then inflected by, because remember, Schumer is not a New York politician. He's a national politician. If he were acting on the state level, he could say that we have a majority, but he's acting as a federal leader, right? Okay, so he's part of the federal government, right? So given the conditions under which voting works and the distortions in that red blue poll that I demonstrated, that narrow majority is effectively reversed, and you have a majority of what that math does is that it takes that narrow majority and it transforms it in terms of voting power and voting ability, right? Which is how politics works, into the opposite of what it is. And you have, in fact, a political power majority that is, in fact, pro-life. And so when he says a vote on this legislation is not an abstract exercise, this is as urgent and real as it gets. And I agree that this is as urgent and real as it gets. However, and I also agree that the vote on this legislation is not an abstract exercise. But what he pretends in the next sentence that it is, in fact, is something that it is not. We will vote to protect a woman's right to choose, and every American is going to see which side every senator stands. And that's true, but what it seems to imply is that the rationale, right, is to say, okay, so the majority of Americans are on our side, and so we're going to have this symbolic vote to demonstrate that we're doing the right thing, even though these evil senators are getting in our way, right? Okay. The problem is that with doing this at the national level, is that in those states, right, in which voters have more voter clout because they have smaller number of voting subjects, you know, per state, right? So there's a problem with the implicit, right, rationale of this argument that every American is going to see which side every senator stands on. If you understand that the rationale here is not just to show, right, but to motivate. And you understand that showing in this instance is formulated within a system, right, not in which every American and every American's vote is counted equally, but in which those distortions of voting clout are very much part of the political reality. So this rhetoric pretends to be, you know, about one individual, one vote, every American, but every American, Chuck 1600 Schumer just failed to protect every American's right to vote. Chuck 1600 Schumer just failed, right, to protect every American's right to have an equal voting clout weight. Chuck 1600 Schumer is very proud of that number 1600 that I'm sure to him doesn't represent some abstract exercise, and yet, you know, is incapable of doing the math and seeing where this one-to-one correspondence is a function, is hiding the way that the political voting system actually evaluates what democracy is, right? So perhaps not understanding what a narrow margin this issue lies on, right? What he's effectively doing is he's reifying the division on this issue in terms of the binary opposition between the Republican Party's stance on this issue and the Democrat stance on this issue. At a national level, the symbolic act of running this through without having the ability or hope, right, of producing a bill that becomes law on the Senate floor is just giving weight and power to the Republican platform on this particular issue, in which, you know, you have to understand this chart, you know, in all of those ways that I talked about the way that that fluctuation might represent, public opinion, as well as how it's inflected by this chart. And so, going back to Schumer's statement, this is not an abstract exercise. This is as urgent and real as it gets. We will vote to protect a woman's right to choose, and every American is going to see which side every senator stands. All right, so given all of that, right, why would Schumer want this? Why would he want every American to see which side every senator stands? Well, in fact, he misrepresents his own argument, because if that were the case, he would either be making a foolish mistake, because he'd be showing that middle American Idaho pig farmer that is very much identified, right, as a pro-lifer, that Democrats were the bad guy, and that they were on the right track in using their powerful voting clout. The most powerful voting clout is in Idaho, or not Idaho, Wyoming, right? So the smaller the population, the more voting clout you have. And that's where these elections are determined, in the key states where small numbers of voters, make a difference, like for example Arizona, which was a key state, or like Georgia. They're not determined by California voters or New York voters. So strategically, Chuck 1600 Schumer is either being extraordinarily foolish, or he doesn't believe in his own rhetoric, and he can't possibly be that foolish. So what he really wants is for every New Yorker to see exactly what side he stands on, and his refusal, right, beyond, the limits of what can be accomplished by this vote, to cave in, right? And so effectively, it's about ensuring the results of his continued success as a politician, whether he actually gets stuff done or not. Like, make that 1600 really look good. So it's not an abstract exercise. And the rhetoric here, I agree with that. But the exercise is an exercise in being reelected without actually accomplishing anything. Just like the SAT test is an exercise in getting a high score on the SAT. Say the SAT was about tables instead of about math and science and literature and history. Say the SAT was about making tables. You would be able to get effectively a 1600 on the SAT and know all about the discourse of making tables. But given the tools, hammer, saw, nails, screws, screwdrivers, and whatever other tool that you needed to make that table, whatever that 1600 represented, if you couldn't make that table, you wouldn't be considered a good table maker. So how is it that holding a vote in which you know the foregone conclusion of the exercise of holding that vote makes you irrelevant political force. Couldn't we say the same thing about what we said about tables? And so, you know, going back to Manchin and Sinema, who I promised that I wouldn't talk about, but you know, Manchin saying that the filibuster is our only insurance of continued democracy, you know, is extraordinarily naive. The Republican counterparts will not hesitate once they retake, and this is the fascist direction that our country is going in. Once they retake the Senate and the House, they will not hesitate, you know. To get rid of the filibuster if it serves their purposes. So unless an understanding, right, of strategy and the way that these systems actually work and what public opinion actually is becomes part of the way that you do your job, you're just abstractly playing with numbers like 1, 6, 0, and 0.